The waiting room smells of floor wax and old paper. There is a particular quality to that smell. Institutional, faintly antiseptic, threaded underneath with something warmer, like the wool of someone's coat drying near a radiator. The chairs are orange vinyl. They make a small sound when you shift your weight. The clock on the wall has a second hand that moves in stuttering increments, as though it too is waiting for something that keeps not quite arriving. It is 1962. The magazines on the low table are 3 months out of date. There is a ladies' home journal with a woman on the cover holding a casserole dish, beaming at something just off frame. There is a Good Housekeeping with a special feature on kitchen organisation. There is a McCall's with a 2-page spread on the modern wife's guide to staying young. You have read all of them already. You read the same ones last month. From behind the closed door of the consultation room, you can hear the low murmur of a conversation. The doctor's voice, measured and unhurried. A woman's voice, quieter. Then the soft scratch of a fountain pen across paper. That specific sound, decisive and final. The sound of something being prescribed. A moment later, the door opens. A woman in a blue coat steps out, folding a small slip of paper into her handbag without looking at it. She nods at you without quite making eye contact. You nod back. The receptionist calls your name. You gather your coat, your bag, your composure. You go in. On the desk between you and the doctor there is a model of a human skeleton, a framed certificate, a glass paperweight with a bubble suspended at its centre. The doctor folds his hands. He has been doing this for 23 years. He knows, before you have finished your first sentence, exactly what he is going to write. What he writes will shape the next 30 years of your life in ways neither of you can see from this side of the desk. What he writes is based on research. Good research, he believes. Solid research. Research published in respected journals by men with impressive credentials. Research that arrived in his consulting room via a detail man in a good suit, who left behind a glossy brochure and a box of sample packets, and a smile that never faltered once. The fountain pen moves. The paper receives it. Somewhere in a boardroom you will never visit, someone who has never met you already knows what he's going to write. This is a story about a drug. Not a dangerous drug, or not exactly, which is partly what makes it interesting. This is a story about a drug that was prescribed to millions of women over the course of several decades, then abruptly stopped, then cautiously restarted, then debated fiercely, then restarted again, and is being debated still. It is a story about the gap between what women were told and what was known. It is a story about who funded the research that shaped what doctors believed and how long it took anyone to ask the question out loud. The drug is estrogen, or more precisely hormone replacement therapy. A phrase that contains within it a particular ideology, a particular assumption that something has been lost and must be replaced. That the body after menopause is a body in deficit. That what medicine offers is not an intervention but a correction. The language was chosen carefully. The language was always chosen carefully. You are going to move through this story slowly. There is no urgency here. These events have already happened. The women who lived through them have already lived through them. What you can do, settling into wherever you are right now, the familiar weight of your blanket, the dark behind your closed eyes, the particular quality of the air in this room at this hour, is simply listen. Let the story come to you the way everything comes to you when you're almost asleep. Gently, without insistence, without alarm. We will begin in a waiting room in 1962, which is also where we just were, which is not a coincidence. We will move through the years as the science shifted, as the funding moved, as the advice to women changed with a confidence that bore no relation to the uncertainty underneath it. We will pass through the optimism of the early years, when estrogen seemed to promise not just comfort but transformation. We will sit in the offices of the pharmaceutical companies that funded the studies, and we will notice what they chose to measure and what they chose not to. We will be present for the day in 2002 when a major study was stopped early and the prescriptions collapsed, 66% in 18 months, and we will notice that the question of who had funded the previous 30 years of research was not, in any major newspaper, the headline. And then we will come back here, to the waiting room, to the scratch of the fountain pen, to the small amber bottle on a kitchen counter in 1963, standing next to the salt shaker and the coffee tin, utterly unremarkable in its presence there, as ordinary as anything. The room is quiet, the clock moves in its stuttering way. You're already beginning to drift. That is good. That is exactly right. Let the story begin. It is 1947, and the returning soldiers need their jobs back. This is not a secret. It is barely even a policy. It is more like a current, something in the water, something in the air of every office and factory and government building, a collective understanding that has the force of inevitability. Women who had spent the war years driving ambulances and riveting fuselages and managing household finances with a precision that would have impressed any corporate treasurer are now being gently, firmly, cheerfully redirected back to the kitchen, back to the suburb, back to the body. The body. This is where it gets interesting. Because the body that post-war American culture demanded of women was not simply a domestic body, a body that cooked and cleaned and raised children. It was a particular kind of body. Slender, controlled, smooth. A body that did not betray effort or age or hunger, that moved through the world as though maintaining itself required no effort at all. The ideal was specific in the way ideals always are when they are serving a purpose beyond aesthetics. You understand, settling deeper into whatever surface is holding you now, that none of this was straightforward. Women did not simply accept the post-war domestic script without negotiation, without private resistance, without their own complicated feelings about what was being asked of them. But the culture was very good at making resistance feel like personal failure. If you were unhappy in your gleaming kitchen, if you felt vague and restless and not quite yourself, the problem was located inside you, not in the arrangements around you. This would become important later. The tendency to locate the problem inside the woman's body would become, in the hands of pharmaceutical marketing, extraordinarily useful. There is a particular word that recurs in women's magazines of this era, in advice columns and medical columns and the general background hum of cultural expectation. The word is adjustment. Women must adjust. After the disruption of the war years, they must adjust back to their proper role. Adjustment is framed as natural, as something a healthy, well-functioning woman would accomplish without difficulty. The woman who failed to adjust, who remained restless, who felt inexplicably sad, who found the suburban kitchen insufficient, was a woman whose body or mind was not working correctly. The adjustment that was required was often pharmacological. Amphetamines had arrived in the civilian medicine cabinet via the military. Soldiers had been given Benzedrine to stay alert on long missions, to march further, to fight longer. After the war, the pharmaceutical companies that had supplied the military found themselves with manufacturing capacity and expertise, and a product that, it turned out, had considerable civilian appeal. Benzedrine made you alert. It suppressed your appetite. It made the housework feel urgent and manageable. The children feel manageable. The whole compressed project of domestic life feel, for a few hours, like something you had chosen and were good at. By 1950, an estimated 1 in 20 American women had been prescribed some form of amphetamine. By 1960, that number had risen to something closer to 1 in 10. The prescriptions were written for weight loss, for depression, for the specific nameless malaise that the era called nerves. A doctor in a 1958 medical journal described his typical patient as a housewife experiencing difficulties with energy and motivation, for whom a daily dose of Dexedrine produced, quote, a remarkable improvement in outlook and productivity. The word productivity sat there in the medical journal without irony. It still does. What this has to do with estrogen and hormone replacement therapy is this. The pharmaceutical infrastructure for medicating women's lives was already fully built when estrogen arrived. The idea that the female body was a problem to be corrected with chemistry, that mood, weight, energy, adjustment were all things that medicine could and should manage, was already deeply embedded in the culture, in the medical profession, in the way women understood themselves and their relationship to their own experience. When HRT arrived, it arrived into a world that had already decided that the biochemistry of the female body was properly the province of the pharmaceutical industry. The waiting room was already there. The prescription pad was already warm from use. All that was needed was a new drug, a new indication, and a new story about what the female body lacked and what science could restore. The post-war years had been very good practice. There is something almost soothing in retrospect about the clarity of the machinery. Not the content of it. The content is its own long conversation, one you're going to have slowly over the next several hours in the comfortable dark. But the mechanics, the way that culture and medicine and commerce move together in the same direction, without any of them, perhaps, quite understanding that they were moving in a direction at all. Everyone believed they were simply responding to need. The women needed help, medicine provided it. The companies made the medicine. The detail men explained the medicine to the doctors. The doctors wrote the prescriptions. The women adjusted. Outside the window of the post-war suburb, the elm trees are full. The sprinklers turn in lazy arcs across the front lawns. Someone is mowing. Someone is always mowing. Inside, a woman sets a casserole in the oven, takes her pill, and waits for the particular quality of energy that arrives about 20 minutes later. Slightly buzzing, slightly bright, an appetite that has simply stopped asking for things. She has a bridge club in the afternoon. She has a husband coming home at 6. She has a body that the culture has decided must be managed. She's managing it the way she has been told to manage it, with the pills her doctor gives her, in the bottles the pharmacist fills. This story does not begin with estrogen. It begins here, in the suburb, in the hum of the refrigerator and the spray of the sprinkler and the particular silence of a hunger that has been chemically suppressed. It begins with the premise, already accepted, already unremarkable, that the female body is an adjustment project. That premise will carry us slowly and without alarm all the way to 2002 and beyond. For now, let the sprinklers turn. Let the elm trees hold their summer wait. The evening is long and warm and there is nowhere to be. The chapter that follows begins a few years from here, in a publishing event that would change everything, though nobody quite knew it yet. For now, simply rest in the knowledge that the stage was already set. The players were already in position. The curtain was already rising on something that would take decades to fully see. In 1966, a gynecologist named Robert Wilson published a book. It was called Feminine Forever. It sold 100,000 copies in the first 7 months. It was excerpted in Vogue and Look magazine. It was reviewed warmly in dozens of newspapers. It arrived at a particular cultural moment with the precision of something that had been aimed. Robert Wilson was a Brooklyn obstetrician with a private practice and a gift for a phrase. He had been writing about estrogen since the 1960s, publishing papers in medical journals, giving lectures, corresponding with pharmaceutical companies. He believed, or said he believed, which in this story is the same thing, that menopause was a disease, not a natural transition, not a life stage, but a deficiency state, a kind of slow decay, a failure of the body to maintain itself. The estrogen that the ovaries stopped producing after menopause was, in Wilson's framing, the substance that kept women feminine. Without it, women became something less, something post, something that required correction. Feminine Forever is, in retrospect, an extraordinary document. It is worth sitting with for a moment, not its conclusions, which have been extensively revisited, but its language, its texture, its particular combination of medical authority and romantic urgency. Wilson described menopausal women as suffering from a living decay, their bodies becoming flabby and shrunken, their breasts withering, their personalities eroding. He described estrogen replacement as a treatment not just for symptoms but for the condition of being a post-reproductive woman. He promised that women who took estrogen would remain, in his word, feminine. The word does a great deal of work in that book. It always does. What the book did not prominently feature was a disclosure. Robert Wilson's research, his foundation, his speaking tours, his considerable public profile, all of it was substantially funded by the pharmaceutical companies that manufactured estrogen. Wyeth, the maker of Premarin, the estrogen product that would come to dominate the market, had contributed to Wilson's Robert A. Wilson Research Foundation. This was not a secret exactly, but it was not printed in Vogue. It was not mentioned in the newspaper reviews. It was available, if you knew where to look, in the financial records that became public only decades later. Premarin, the drug at the centre of this story, has a history that is itself worth a quiet moment of attention. It had been approved by the FDA in 1942, originally for the treatment of menopausal symptoms, hot flushes, night sweats, the constellation of experiences that accompany the transition. Its name is a contraction, pregnant mare urine. It was, and is, extracted from the urine of pregnant mares. By the time Wilson published Feminine Forever, Premarin was already one of the most prescribed drugs in America. After Feminine Forever, it would become the most prescribed. You are resting now. The weight of the blanket is exactly right. The temperature of the room is exactly right. None of this requires any response from you. It is simply a story unfolding in the comfortable dark, the facts arriving quietly and without urgency, the way all facts arrive when you're not required to do anything about them. Simply let them settle. The timing of Feminine Forever matters. 1966 was the year that also saw the publication of Betty Friedan's The Feminine Mystique, now 4 years old and still reverberating. The women's movement was building. The birth control pill had arrived in 1960 and had begun quietly and then loudly to reframe the relationship between women, their bodies, and medicine. There was a particular tension in the culture around what women's bodies were for and who had authority over them. Into this tension, Wilson's book arrived with a very specific message. Your body is a problem, medicine has the solution, and the solution will keep you young. The solution came in a small tablet. Later, in a patch. Later still, in gels and creams and various delivery systems that made the whole enterprise feel modern and tailored and precise. But in 1966 it was a small tablet, taken daily, exactly like the birth control pill, and what it promised was something the birth control pill did not. Not freedom from pregnancy, but freedom from age. Freedom from the particular visible changes that the culture had decided were unfeminine. Freedom, in Wilson's specific framing, from becoming a castrate, his word deployed without apparent awareness of its violence, after menopause. The medical profession received Feminine Forever with a range of responses that mirrored the culture. Some gynecologists were enthusiastic. The promise of estrogen was real in certain respects. It did address hot flushes, did reduce vaginal dryness, did affect mood and sleep in ways that many women found significant. Some doctors were skeptical of Wilson's more extravagant claims, but willing to accept the pharmacological logic. Some were uncomfortable with the ideological freight of the whole enterprise, but found it difficult to articulate precisely why within the language available to them. The language available to them was the language of medicine, which was good at describing deficiencies and corrections and replacement and treatment, and considerably less fluent in discussing whether the thing being corrected was actually a deficiency or simply a life stage that had been reframed as one for commercial reasons. Medicine and commerce have always shared a vocabulary, and in 1966 that vocabulary was working very hard in favour of estrogen. The detail men arrived in doctors' offices with Premarin samples and brochures. The brochures contained case studies of women transformed, energised, calm, their marriages restored, their confidence returned. The case studies were real, in the sense that the women described had taken estrogen and felt better. They were incomplete, in the sense that the long-term effects, what estrogen did to the uterine lining, what it might do to breast tissue, what happened when you took it for a decade or 2 decades, were, at this stage, not known. The brochures did not dwell on this. The brochures were not designed to dwell on this. By 1968, Premarin was the 5th most prescribed drug in the United States. By 1975, it was the most prescribed drug in the United States. Millions of women were taking it. Their doctors had told them it was safe. Their doctors believed it was safe. The evidence that had shaped their doctors' beliefs had been substantially funded by the company that made it. This is not a conspiracy. It is a system. The system was working exactly as it had been designed to work. Feminine Forever is still available. You can buy it on the internet. Reading it now has a particular quality. The grandiosity of the claims, the beauty of the marketing language, the absolute confidence in a solution that was still, in 1966, almost entirely without long-term safety data. It reads like the cough syrup advertisements from 60 years earlier, with their cheerful promises and their complete absence of anything so inconvenient as doubt. The era was different. The drug was different. The structure of the confidence, the shape of the certainty, the relationship between the claims and the funding behind them, these were familiar. Let the familiar weight of these patterns settle into the room. There is nothing alarming here, only the recognition that this has happened before and will happen again, and is, even now, in some form happening. The body of knowledge shifts. The certainties revise. What feels settled is usually less settled than it appears. And somewhere, always, a detail man is smiling. leaving a sample, closing a door quietly behind him on his way to the next office. If you're drifting now, let yourself go. Subscribe so the next story is waiting when you return. Sleep well. The bottle is the size of a film canister. It is amber-coloured, pharmaceutical amber, the particular brown that is designed to protect the contents from light, while simultaneously looking serious and medical and trustworthy. The label is white with dark lettering. Premarin, 0.625 milligrams. Take 1 tablet daily. Dr. Henderson. Refills, 3. It sits on the kitchen counter between the salt and the small ceramic rooster that a sister brought back from Portugal. It is entirely unremarkable in its position there. It has been there since February. It is 1971. The woman who takes this tablet every morning is 53 years old. She has been menopausal for 2 years. She went to Dr. Henderson when the night sweats became disruptive enough that her husband began sleeping in the guest room, not unkindly, but with the particular practicality of a man for whom sleep deprivation was a logistical problem to be solved. Dr. Henderson listened to her description of her symptoms with the focused attention of a man who had heard this description many times and had a very clear response prepared. He described estrogen replacement. He described the evidence for it. He wrote the prescription with confidence. She had read Feminine forever. Not all of it, but enough. It had been passed around her bridge club like a compelling novel, and several women had quoted it to their husbands, and several husbands had encouraged their wives to speak to their doctors. The book had said things she recognised. Not the more extreme passages about castrates and living decay. Those had struck her as rather too much, a little unpleasant in their urgency, but the underlying premise, that what she was feeling was a deficiency, that the right medicine could restore what had been lost, that medicine was offering her something genuinely useful. The tablet is very small. It is coated in a faint film that makes it slightly slippery against the fingers. She takes it with her morning coffee, the first sip, before breakfast, a habit she established in the first week because the pharmacist had mentioned that some women experienced mild nausea if they took it on an empty stomach. The nausea passed after a few days. She no longer notices taking it. It has become as automatic as the coffee itself, as the orange juice, as the particular sequence of a weekday morning that she has repeated for so many years that it requires no thought at all. Within 6 weeks, the night sweats diminished. Within 3 months, they had essentially stopped. She slept through the night. Her husband returned to the main bedroom with the mild gratitude of a man for whom everything had returned to normal, which for him it had. She felt better. This is important and should not be dismissed. She felt genuinely, noticeably better. The hot flushes that had been interrupting her days, sudden, embarrassing, the face going red at the supermarket, at the school gates, at lunch with her daughter-in-law, those stopped too. The joint aches that she had been attributing to cold weather improved somewhat. Her sleep was deeper. The quality of her days changed. This is the thing that is easy to lose in discussions of HRT that focus on the risks and the funding and the marketing. The women who took it often felt better. Not all of them, not always. But often enough, and significantly enough, that the relationship between millions of women and this drug was not simply a relationship between gullibility and corporate manipulation. It was more complicated than that. She felt better, and so she took the tablets, and so did her friends and their friends. And the word of mouth that passed through the bridge clubs and the coffee mornings and the quiet conversations in the supermarket car park was genuine. It was also, in its own way, part of the marketing infrastructure, though nobody would have called it that. The pharmaceutical companies understood this. The detail men who visited doctors' offices in the early 1970s were very good at one thing in particular. They understood that the best evidence for a drug was a patient who felt better. When a woman told her doctor that she felt transformed, that was worth more than any journal article. The companies funded patient testimonial campaigns. They funded women's health magazines. They funded educational materials for doctors that featured case studies of women who'd been restored, the word Wilson had used and that the industry had kept, to themselves. There is a brochure in a medical archive somewhere that was produced by Wyeth in 1973. It is aimed at gynecologists. Its cover shows a woman in her 50s, who appears to be in her late 30s, dressed in the particular elegant casual style of the era. Slacks, a silk blouse, hair carefully done. She is laughing at something off frame. The text begins, "She never used to be like this." What had she been like before? The brochure does not say exactly. Vague, perhaps. Difficult. Not herself. The medicine the brochure implies without stating directly has returned her to herself. Returned her to the ease and brightness and visible youth that is apparently her true and natural state, rather than a set of characteristics that the drug produces and the company profits from. In the kitchen in 1971, she is not thinking about brochures. She is thinking about what to make for dinner. She is thinking about whether her daughter's cold has cleared up. She is thinking about the letter she needs to write to the insurance company about the car. Her life is a normal life, a life full of its own ordinary textures and preoccupations, and her tablet is simply part of it now, as unremarkable as the ceramic rooster and the amber bottle and the particular light at this hour of the morning coming through the window over the sink. She does not know that in 1975 a study will be published showing that women taking estrogen without progesterone have a significantly elevated risk of uterine cancer, a risk that increases with the duration of use. She does not know that the response to this study will not be to withdraw estrogen from the market, but to add progesterone, creating the combined hormone therapy that will come to be called HRT. She does not know that the uterine cancer finding will shake the prescribing figures briefly before the companies regroup, reformulate and rebuild the market with the new combined product. She does not know any of this because it has not happened yet, and because, even when it does happen, the information that reaches her will be filtered through her doctor and through the pharmaceutical companies' public relations departments, and through the general cultural tendency to locate the problem in the small print and the reassurance in the headline. She finishes her coffee. She washes the cup. She takes the small amber bottle and puts it back in the medicine cabinet in the bathroom, next to the aspirin and the cold cream and the bottle of her husband's aftershave. She'll take another tablet tomorrow, and the day after that. For how long? Dr. Henderson had been vague about this. As long as she needed it, as long as it was helping, which it certainly was. The morning proceeds, the kitchen fills with light, the ceramic rooster surveys its small domain of salt and pepper and the corner of a dish towel draped over the oven handle. Outside, a car starts somewhere down the street. The day begins in the ordinary way that days do, completely unaware of itself, carrying within it everything that it is and everything that will eventually be said about it. Later, much later, in another decade, in another century, someone will look back at this kitchen, at this bottle, at this woman swallowing her tablet with her morning coffee, and they will have very definite opinions about what was happening here. Some will say she was deceived, some will say she was helped, some will say both things at once, because both things at once is the most accurate description of a situation in which the help was real and the information was incomplete, and the people who held the complete information had very good reasons for not sharing it. For now, she is simply a woman in a kitchen on a Tuesday morning, and the light is coming through the window, and the coffee is warm, and everything is fine. There is a building in Philadelphia that you have almost certainly never thought about. It is not a dramatic building. It is the kind of building that corporate headquarters often are, respectably designed, neither ostentatious nor humble, with a lobby that smells of climate control and carpet shampoo and the particular neutral cleanliness of a place where decisions are made and papers are signed, and then the people who made them go home to their families and think of themselves accurately as ordinary people doing their jobs. Wyeth Laboratories occupied this kind of building for most of its existence. By the 1960s, Wyeth was one of the largest pharmaceutical companies in America. Its consumer products division made cough syrups and vitamins and the kind of everyday remedies that populated medicine cabinets across the country. Its prescription division was where the serious money was, and Premarin, the conjugated equine estrogen synthesized from the urine of pregnant mares, was, by the late 1960s, the serious money. To understand what Wyeth did with Premarin over the next 3 decades, it helps to understand the pharmaceutical industry's relationship to medical research in the post-war period. This relationship is complicated and has been written about extensively and continues to be debated, and what follows is not an accusation but a description. The description goes like this. Pharmaceutical companies fund research into their own products. They fund it through grants to academic researchers, through the establishment of research foundations, through symposia and conferences and continuing medical education events for doctors. The research they fund tends to produce results that are favourable to their products. This is not because the researchers are dishonest. Most of them are not. It is because funded research into a drug tends to ask the questions that a drug company wants asked, measure the outcomes that a drug company wants measured, and present the results in a context that a drug company finds useful. The studies that Wyeth funded directly and indirectly in the 1960s and 1970s focused on the benefits of estrogen therapy. They measured symptom relief, which was real and demonstrable and important. They measured bone density, because estrogen was protective against osteoporosis, and this was a finding that supported long-term use. They measured cardiovascular markers in ways that, at the time, suggested estrogen might be protective against heart disease. This last finding would become enormously important and enormously contested in the following decades. What the early studies did not measure with comparable rigour was breast cancer risk. This is the fact that sits at the centre of this story like a stone in a shoe. Not dramatic enough to cause a fall, present enough to affect the gait. The relationship between estrogen and breast cancer was known to be biologically plausible as early as the 1960s. Animal studies had shown estrogen-dependent tumour growth. Epidemiological evidence was beginning to accumulate. But the studies that shaped clinical practice, the studies that detail men carried into doctors' offices, the studies that formed the basis of the advice that millions of women received, were not primarily studies of breast cancer risk. There is a concept in research methodology called publication bias. It describes the tendency for studies with positive findings, studies that show a drug works, to be published, and studies with negative or null findings, studies that show it does not work or causes harm, to remain unpublished, or to be published in less prominent journals, or to be published later. Publication bias is not unique to pharmaceutical research. It affects the whole of science to some degree. But in pharmaceutical research, where the entity funding the study also controls what happens to the results, publication bias is a structural feature rather than an occasional distortion. Several studies conducted in the 1970s that found elevated cancer risks associated with long-term estrogen use were not published promptly. Some were suppressed, some were delayed. In 2010, internal Wyeth documents were made public as part of litigation, and they showed that the company had paid a medical communications firm to write papers on behalf of medical researchers, papers that were then published under those researchers' names in peer-reviewed journals in a practice known as ghostwriting. The papers presented estrogen therapy in a favourable light. The medical communications firm was paid. The researchers received publication credits. The journals received the papers without knowing about the firm's involvement. The doctors who read the journals received information about the drug that was accurate in its facts and carefully curated in its framing. This was not unusual practice. It is worth sitting with that for a moment. This was not unusual practice. Medical ghostwriting was, during this period, an accepted part of the pharmaceutical industry's engagement with the medical literature. The industry's own standards did not prohibit it. The journal's disclosure requirements did not catch it. The system was working as it was designed to work, and the design included this. The detail men who visited doctors' offices in the 1970s and 1980s were not, as individuals, doing anything they understood to be wrong. They were selling a product. They were trained to sell a product. They were given materials, the studies, the brochures, the samples that their employers had prepared, and they presented those materials to doctors who were busy and who trusted the journals the materials cited and who believed, reasonably, that a study published in a reputable journal had been subjected to rigorous independent review. The doctors prescribed the drug. The women took the tablets. The company made money. The system was coherent. By 1992, Premarin was the most prescribed drug in the United States. It had been the most prescribed drug in the United States for nearly a decade. Over a 6-year period in the 1990s, Wyeth reported that it spent approximately $30 million on direct consumer advertising for Premarin. It spent considerably more than that on physician education. Physician education was the term used for the conferences, the symposia, the continuing medical education events, the speaker programs in which prominent physicians were paid to present data about estrogen to other physicians. The physicians who spoke at these events were not, as a rule, corrupt. They believed what they were saying. They had read the literature that shaped their beliefs had been substantially funded by Wyeth. In the United States in 1992, a woman reaching the age of 50 could expect her doctor to recommend hormone replacement therapy. The conversation in the consulting room was not, typically, a nuanced discussion of the evidence and its limitations and the funding behind it. It was a recommendation. The recommendation was based on a body of evidence that had been shaped over 30 years by the financial interests of the company that stood to benefit from it. This is not a conspiracy. It is a system. And systems of this kind are not dismantled by exposing individual bad actors, because the individual actors are not, for the most part, bad. They are participants in a structure that has its own momentum, its own internal logic, its own very effective way of presenting itself as simply the way things are done. The way things are done. The phrase has a weight to it, a solidity, a particular resistance to examination. The way things are done is not usually defended. It is simply enacted. And in the years before 2002, the way things were done was that women took estrogen, and their doctors recommended it. And the evidence that recommended it had been built on 30 years of pharmaceutical funding, and nobody in a major newspaper had yet asked that particular question in those particular terms. Somewhere in the Philadelphia building in 1992, in a conference room that smells of coffee and carpet shampoo, a meeting is finishing. Papers are gathered, briefcases click shut. The people in the room are not monsters. They are people in suits doing their jobs in a building on a Tuesday afternoon, and they're about to go home to their families, and the world outside the window is very ordinary in the flat winter light. They have no idea what is coming, or perhaps a few of them do and are already thinking about how to manage it. It is hard to know from this distance which is which. Women know things before they have words for them. This is not mysticism. It is the ordinary consequence of paying close attention to a body and a life, the kind of attention that accumulates over years into something that looks like intuition and is actually just information, carefully gathered and stored in places that do not always have easy access to language. Through the 1970s and 1980s, as HRT prescriptions rose and the pharmaceutical infrastructure behind them grew more sophisticated, and the medical consensus solidified into something that felt like certainty, women were noticing things. They were noticing them privately, in the way that women often notice things that contradict the official story, quietly, with a sense that perhaps they were the exception, that perhaps the problem was them, that perhaps the feeling of unease was not information but anxiety. There was a woman in Ohio in 1979 who had been on Premarin for 4 years when she was diagnosed with endometrial cancer. Her doctor explained that the combined HRT regimen was now preferred, estrogen with progesterone added to protect the uterine lining, and that the new formulation was safe. She switched to the combined pill. She had a sense, which she could not fully articulate, that she was being managed rather than informed, that the problem had been found and the solution had been provided, and the part that was supposed to come between, the part where someone explained to her what had gone wrong and why it had not been anticipated and what was actually known, that part had been somewhat compressed. There was a woman in California in 1983 who'd been on HRT for 7 years when she was diagnosed with breast cancer. She asked her oncologist whether there was a connection. He said that the evidence on breast cancer risk was mixed, that there were studies pointing in both directions, that her cancer was likely not related to the HRT. This was a medically reasonable answer given what was published at the time. It was also a medically incomplete answer given what was known but not published. She had no way to know the difference. She stopped the HRT and resumed chemotherapy, and spent considerable time wondering whether the wondering itself was useful. There was a woman in London in 1986 who was told by her GP that HRT was protective against heart disease. This was the prevailing view based on observational studies that showed lower rates of heart disease among HRT users. The GP was not wrong to believe this. He had read the studies. He did not know, could not know from the published record, that observational studies of this kind were subject to a selection bias called the healthy user effect, that the women who sought out and took HRT tended to be healthier, better educated, more likely to exercise and maintain a healthy weight than women who did not. The lower rates of heart disease in HRT users might not have been caused by the HRT. They might have been caused by the fact that the typical HRT user was already a lower risk woman. But the published record, shaped by the research that had been funded and the research that had been published did not make this distinction easily legible. The woman took her prescription and was glad of it, and was, on the evidence available to her, entirely reasonable to do so. The things women noticed were soft things, not dramatic enough for a doctor's appointment, not specific enough for a complaint. A feeling of unease about taking something indefinitely, when the indefinitely had never been properly defined. A friend who had been on HRT for a decade and was now being treated for something gynecological. The details were private. A magazine article that said the benefits outweighed the risks, followed 6 months later by another magazine article that said the same thing with slightly different statistics, and then another, and the statistics kept being slightly different and the conclusion kept being the same, and after a while the consistency of the conclusion despite the shifting of the evidence started to feel like something worth noticing. There is a sociological concept called epistemic injustice, which describes the situation in which someone is not given the credibility they deserve as a source of knowledge, in which their testimony is discounted, their capacity for understanding underestimated, their knowledge dismissed because of who they are. Women in medicine have historically experienced epistemic injustice in specific and well-documented ways. The woman who reported a symptom that her doctor found implausible, the woman whose pain was attributed to anxiety, the woman whose concern about a medication was addressed with reassurance rather than investigation. Women who expressed reservations about HRT in this period were often told that their reservations were unfounded, that the science was settled, that the benefits clearly outweighed the risks. Some of these women had reservations that were indeed unfounded. Some of them had reservations that were, in retrospect, prescient, that were tracking something real in their bodies or their situations that the published science had not yet caught up with. There was no reliable way to distinguish between the two kinds of reservation in the consulting room, and in the absence of a reliable way to distinguish, the one backed by pharmaceutical funding and 3 decades of published literature tended to win. There is a woman I want to stay with for a moment. She is 61, it is 1988, and she's been on combined HRT for 6 years. She feels well, better than well. Her hot flushes are gone, her sleep is good. Her bones, at her last scan, are in excellent condition. Her doctor is pleased with her. She is by any reasonable measure a success story for the product. She is also feeling, in a way she cannot easily describe, a faint background unease about the indefinite continuation of what she had thought of when she started as a temporary measure. She had thought of it as a bridge. She has been on the bridge for 6 years now and cannot quite see the other side. She asks her doctor how long she should continue. Her doctor says as long as it's helping you. She asks what the evidence says about long-term use. Her doctor says the evidence is very positive, very reassuring. She asks specifically about breast cancer. Her doctor says the evidence on that is mixed, but the overall picture is favourable. She nods. She refills her prescription. She will continue for another 7 years before the events of 2002 will, very quickly, change everything. For now, she is simply a woman at a desk in a consulting room, asking the questions she has, receiving the answers that the system is set up to give her, and returning to the life she is living, which is a good life, a life she's grateful for, a life in which the small amber bottle on the bathroom shelf is simply part of the furniture. What she does not know, and what none of the women in this chapter know, is that in 1991, a National Institutes of Health researcher named Bernadine Healy will launch the Women's Health Initiative, a large-scale, long-term, randomized controlled trial designed to answer the questions that the decades of observational research had not cleanly settled. What is the actual effect of HRT on heart disease, on breast cancer, on stroke, on blood clots, over a sufficient period in a properly controlled study? The study will begin recruiting in 1993. Its results will not be available for nearly a decade. When they arrive, in 2002, they will arrive very fast. But that is later. For now, the women are in their kitchens and their consulting rooms and their bridge clubs. They are taking their tablets. They are feeling better, or they are feeling unsure, or they are simply continuing because continuing is what you do when stopping has not been suggested. They are accumulating quietly the private knowledge that precedes the public reckoning. They are noticing things. They do not have the words yet. The words are coming. The night is quiet. Whatever sounds the world is making, the distant traffic, the heating settling, the particular softness of a house at rest. Those sounds are part of the quiet rather than opposed to it. You are drifting. The amber bottle sits on its shelf in 1988, and the orange vinyl waiting room chair is 30 years in the future, and none of it requires anything from you right now. Simply rest here, in the soft space between the knowing and the knowing, where all of history lives when it is not being looked at directly. In 1985, the New England Journal of Medicine published the results of a large observational study. It was called the Nurses' Health Study, and it had been following a cohort of more than 100,000 registered nurses since 1976, tracking their health outcomes in relation to their lifestyle choices and medical treatments. The study was rigorous. The methodology was careful. The researchers were credible and independent. The findings on hormone replacement therapy were, for the pharmaceutical industry, extraordinarily welcome. Women who used HRT had significantly lower rates of coronary heart disease than women who did not. The reduction was substantial, somewhere between 30 and 50% depending on the analysis. Heart disease was the leading cause of death in postmenopausal women. If HRT could reduce that risk by half, the implications were enormous. Not just for women's health, but for the argument about why women should take HRT for years or decades. The symptom relief justification, hot flushes, sleep disruption, vaginal dryness, could carry you through the perimenopausal years, but it did not obviously justify continued use into your 60s and 70s. A cardioprotective effect did. A cardioprotective effect was, in the context of the market for long-term pharmaceutical use, a very significant finding. The pharmaceutical companies moved quickly. Wyeth funded additional research into the cardiovascular effects of estrogen. It funded conferences on the topic. The detail men who visited cardiology practices as well as gynecology practices began carrying materials about HRT and heart health. The American College of Obstetricians and Gynecologists issued guidance supporting the use of HRT for cardiovascular protection. By the early 1990s, it was common for doctors to recommend HRT not just for menopausal symptoms but as a preventive measure against heart disease, to women who were perfectly comfortable and symptom-free, simply on the grounds that their hearts would benefit. The problem with the Nurses' Health Study was the problem that would not be fully appreciated for another decade and a half. It was an observational study. Observational studies track what people do and what happens to them. They do not randomly assign people to different treatments. And when you observe rather than assign, you inherit whatever differences already exist between the groups you are comparing. The women in the Nurses' Health Study who used HRT were not a random sample. They were women who had sought out and continued to use HRT, which meant, among other things, that they had regular access to medical care. They were, on average, better educated than non-users. They were more likely to exercise, to avoid smoking, to monitor their diet, to engage with preventive health measures generally. These characteristics are themselves protective against heart disease. The women in the HRT group were starting from a different baseline than the women in the non-HRT group, not because of the HRT, but because of who the typical HRT user was. This is the healthy user effect. It is a well-known problem in observational epidemiology. It is not a new problem. The researchers who conducted the Nurses' Health Study were aware of it, disclosed it in their paper, and noted that it was a limitation of the study. The limitation was there in the published record. It did not make it into the brochures. It did not travel with the detail men to the cardiology offices. It did not appear, in any prominent form, in the guidance that told doctors to recommend HRT for cardiovascular protection. The distinction between what a study says and what makes it into clinical practice is one of the quieter scandals of modern medicine. A study publishes its findings and its limitations together. Clinical practice adopts the findings. The limitations, which require a particular kind of methodological literacy to evaluate, tend to be lost in translation. This is not a conspiracy. It is partly a knowledge problem, partly an infrastructure problem, and partly a problem of how the pharmaceutical industry chooses to present information and how that presentation shapes what doctors believe. Through the 1990s, the cardioprotective argument for HRT was the argument. It was the reason that millions of women without significant menopausal symptoms were prescribed HRT and continued on it for years. It was the reason that HRT moved from a treatment for menopausal discomfort to a long-term preventive health intervention. It was the reason that by 2002, Somewhere between 6 and 9 million American women were taking it. The exact figure depends on which survey you consult, but the order of magnitude is consistent across sources. There was a clinical trial, separate from the observational studies, that ran through the 1990s. It was called the HRT trial, the Heart and Estrogen/Progestin Replacement Study, and it was, unusually, a randomized controlled trial. Women were actually assigned to receive HRT or placebo, rather than simply observed in their natural choices. The HRT trial, published in 1998, found no reduction in cardiovascular events among HRT users. In fact, in the first year of the trial, there was a modest increase in cardiac events in the HRT group, which then leveled off. No benefit, perhaps a brief increase in risk. The HRT findings should have been, to put it gently, significant. A randomized controlled trial, the gold standard of medical evidence, had failed to replicate the cardiovascular benefit that observational studies had been claiming for a decade. The response from the medical and pharmaceutical establishment was measured. Some doctors revised their thinking, some did not. Wyeth sponsored discussions of the HRT findings at medical conferences, in which speakers explained why the HRT trial, for various methodological reasons, should not be taken as definitive. The women already on HRT for the most part continued their prescriptions. The prescriptions for new patients continued to be written. This is how the system handles inconvenient evidence. Not by ignoring it, it cannot be ignored, it is published, it is in the journal, it exists in the record. But by providing a context for it, a set of interpretive frames through which it can be received as provisional, as one data point among many, as something to be awaited upon before acting. Further research is needed is the most useful phrase in the pharmaceutical lexicon. It does not say the evidence is wrong, it says, please do not change anything yet. Further research was being conducted, in fact. The Women's Health Initiative had been recruiting participants since 1993. It had tens of thousands of women in its cohort. It was designed to run for approximately 15 years. Its results, when they arrived, would not be manageable with the methodological objections that had handled the HRT trial. The results, when they arrived, would arrive very fast and very publicly, and they would change, in 18 months, 3 decades of clinical practice. But in 1998, sitting in the specific light of the late 1990s, none of this is known. A woman in her mid-50s is taking her tablet. Her doctor believes in it. The evidence, as he has been given access to it, supports his belief. The tablet is small, the bottle is amber, the morning is ordinary. She swallows the tablet with her coffee and does not know that she is 4 years from the most dramatic shift in prescribing history that the modern pharmaceutical era has yet produced. She simply drinks her coffee. She goes about her day. There is a conversation that happened millions of times in doctors' offices across America and Britain and Europe and Australia between 1966 and 2002. It had a recognizable shape. It began with the woman describing her symptoms, the heat that rose without warning, the sleep that shattered at 3 in the morning and would not reassemble, the mood that moved in ways that felt foreign and unexplained. The doctor listened. The doctor examined. The doctor recommended. The conversation had a beginning and a middle and an end, and the end was usually a prescription. What is interesting about this conversation, looking at it from this distance, is not what was said, but what was not said. Not because doctors were dishonest, most of them were not, but because what was not said was not available to be said. The information that would have allowed a fuller conversation was, for the most part, either unpublished or published in a form that had not penetrated clinical practice, or framed in a context that made it seem less significant than it was. A woman in 1988 asking her gynecologist about breast cancer risk and HRT would have received information based on the available published evidence. That evidence was mixed. The doctor would likely have said so, but mixed, in the context of 30 years of industry-funded research tilted toward positive findings and a medical culture that had come to regard HRT as a broadly beneficial intervention, meant something closer to generally okay with some caveats than it meant the picture is genuinely uncertain, and here is the specific shape of the uncertainty. The caveats were real, their weight was not always fully conveyed. There is a study from the 1990s that looked at what information women received during HRT consultations. It found that doctors spoke, on average, for a significantly greater proportion of the consultation time than patients. It found that discussions of risk were shorter than discussions of benefit. It found that when patients asked questions about risk, they were more likely to receive reassurance than information. This is not a study of bad doctors. It is a study of a consultation culture that had been shaped in part by the framing provided by pharmaceutical marketing and by a medical establishment that had absorbed over decades a particular story about HRT and had told that story so many times that the story had stopped feeling like a story and had become simply the truth. The truth, as understood in 1995, was something like this. HRT relieves menopausal symptoms, protects bones, probably protects the heart, is generally well tolerated, and should be discussed with your doctor if you are approaching menopause. The truth, as understood in 2002 after the WHI results, would be something rather different. The pivot between these two understandings is the subject of a later chapter. For now, what matters is the world of 1995, the confident world, the world in which the framework felt solid. In that world, a woman who expressed persistent reservations about taking HRT was navigating a particular social and medical dynamic. Her doctor believed in the drug. The medical literature supported the belief. The women around her, many of them, were taking it and feeling better. The cultural narrative, in magazines, in women's health books, in the conversations at the school gates or the bridge club or the office, endorsed it. To refuse HRT in 1995 was not simply a medical decision. It was a decision that required you to hold your own judgment against the weight of medical authority, cultural consensus, and the felt experience of people around you who said the drug had helped them. Some women managed this. Some had instincts they trusted more than authority, or personal histories that made them cautious about hormone manipulation, or family histories of breast cancer that made the calculus different. Some were helped by the early feminist health movement, which had since the 1970s been arguing that women deserved full information about what was being prescribed to them and why, and which had been treated with varying degrees of impatience by the medical establishment for saying so. The Boston Women's Health Book Collective had published Our Bodies Ourselves in 1970, and its successive editions had consistently asked uncomfortable questions about the pharmaceutical treatment of women's bodies. The 1984 edition raised concerns about long-term estrogen use. The authors were not doctors. They were women who had done their research and were uncomfortable with what they found. They were dismissed, in some quarters, as ideological rather than scientific. The question of who is allowed to evaluate evidence about women's bodies is itself a question with a history. What the consultation that didn't happen would have contained, had it been possible in 1995, is approximately this. It would have begun with an acknowledgement that the evidence for HRT was substantially, though not exclusively, derived from studies that had been funded directly or indirectly by pharmaceutical companies with a financial interest in the outcome. It would have discussed the difference between observational studies and randomized controlled trials, and why the distinction matters when evaluating a claim about heart disease prevention. It would have noted that the long-term effects of combined HRT on breast cancer risk were not yet established by properly controlled research. It would have explained what was known, what was not known, and what the specific unknowns were. It would have allowed the woman to weigh these factors herself, in the light of her own history, her own priorities, her own sense of acceptable risk. This conversation was not impossible because doctors were withholding information. It was not impossible because of conspiracy. It was impossible because the information required to have it was not fully available in the clinical record, and the information that was available had been shaped and framed and presented in a way that made the reassuring conclusion seem like the well-evidenced one, and the cautious one seem like the counsel of excessive anxiety. The system produced confident doctors with incomplete evidence, and patients who were told what their doctors believed, and whose doctors believed what the research had told them, and the research had been conducted in an environment substantially funded by people who needed a particular answer. There is a woman in a consulting room in 1997. She's 54. She has just been told that her bone density scan is showing early signs of osteoporosis. Her doctor recommends HRT. He explains the bone protective effect. He explains the heart protective effect, though he notes that a recent trial raised some questions. He does not explain the full shape of those questions. He does not explain who funded the studies on which his recommendation is based. He does not have easy access to that information. He recommends HRT. She accepts the recommendation. She leaves with a prescription. She is not a fool. She is not passive. She is a woman who has trusted a system, and the system has given her the best information it had available, filtered through a set of structures that had shaped that information in ways she has no way of seeing from where she sits. The consultation happened. The relevant conversation, the one about funding and framing and the specific shape of what was known and what was not, did not happen. It could not happen. The room did not contain the materials for it. 5 years later, it will. 5 years later, very suddenly the materials will arrive, and the conversation will become possible, and the prescriptions will fall by 66% in 18 months, and in the quiet aftermath in the millions of kitchens where the amber bottle has been removed from the shelf and not replaced, something will be sitting that does not quite have a name. Not betrayal exactly, not simply surprise, something closer to the specific discomfort of having been given information in a particular frame for many years, and then learning that the frame had not been the only available one, something like that. If you're drifting now, let yourself go. Subscribe so the next story is waiting when you return. Sleep well. On the 9th of July 2002, a press conference was called by the National Heart, Lung and Blood Institute in Bethesda, Maryland. The subject of the press conference was the Women's Health Initiative, the large randomized controlled trial that had been running since 1993, and that had been expected to continue until 2005. It was not going to continue until 2005. The Data Safety Monitoring Board, the independent committee that oversees running trials and is authorized to stop them early if the evidence warrants it, had reviewed the interim data and concluded that the trial should be stopped. The arm of the study that was being stopped was the arm that had been giving women combined estrogen and progestogen therapy. The reason it was being stopped was that the breast cancer findings had crossed a pre-specified threshold of harm. The women enrolled in that arm of the study, more than 16,000 of them, had shown an increased risk of breast cancer compared to the placebo group. The increase was modest in absolute terms, roughly 8 additional cases of breast cancer per 10,000 women per year. But the study was large enough that the signal was clear, and the Data Safety Monitoring Board had a protocol, and the protocol said, stop. The study stopped. Within hours, the finding was on the wire services. By morning, it was on every front page. The New York Times ran it above the fold. The BBC led with it on the radio news. The word risk appeared in every headline. The phrase study halted appeared in most of them. There was, in some coverage, the particular tone of the health scare headline. Urgent, slightly alarmed, written by people who had not been on HRT and were not quite sure how to calibrate the danger for people who were. For the 6 to 9 million American women who are currently taking combined HRT, that morning had a specific quality. Some of them heard the news on the radio while drinking their morning coffee and glanced at the amber bottle on the shelf. Some heard it from their daughters who called. Some read it in the newspaper with a cup of tea, the tablet already taken, the day already started, the news arriving too late to change the morning but not too late to change everything else. The phones at GP surgeries and gynecology offices began ringing before the offices were fully open. The calls had a common shape. Should I stop? The doctors, who were processing the same news from the same press conference, found themselves in the position of advising on a situation whose resolution had not yet been worked out. Stop if you have significant concerns, most said. Come in and we will discuss it. The guidance from professional bodies would follow, but it would take days to arrive, and in the meantime the women who were calling were not wrong to be worried, and the doctors who were answering were not wrong to be uncertain. The morning of the 9th of July 2002 was one of those moments in which the system's confidence was visibly elsewhere. The breast cancer risk was the finding that stopped the study, but it was not the only finding that the WHI produced. The trial also found no reduction in the risk of coronary heart disease. This was significant. The cardioprotective argument, the argument that had driven long-term HRT use for much of the 1990s, the argument that had extended prescriptions beyond the treatment of symptoms into the territory of preventive medicine, was not supported. Women taking combined HRT were not protecting their hearts. They were also at slightly elevated risk of stroke and of venous thromboembolism, blood clots in the legs or lungs. These findings, taken together, represented not just the end of a specific prescribing pattern, but a comprehensive dismantling of the clinical case that had been built for long-term HRT use. The symptom relief case, hot flushes, sleep, vaginal discomfort, remained intact. There was no finding that suggested HRT did not work for these things. But the long-term preventive case, the case for taking estrogen for years or decades, as a form of insurance against the diseases of aging, that case was gone. The studies that had supported it had been, in their majority, observational studies subject to selection bias. The one large randomized trial that had been designed to test the claims had found them wanting. The coverage over the following weeks had one notable absence. It was so consistent an absence that it starts to look like a structural feature of the journalism rather than an oversight. The coverage reported the findings. It reported the risk percentages. It reported the advice to women currently taking HRT. It reported the doctors' responses and the pharmaceutical companies' measured statements about reviewing the evidence. What it did not report, in any prominent way, was the question of who had funded the research that had produced the clinical consensus now being dismantled. It did not ask how the community of researchers and doctors that had recommended long-term HRT for 30 years had come to be so confident, and whether the funding behind the research that shaped that confidence was relevant to understanding how the confidence had been constructed. This is not a criticism of the individual journalists. They were covering a health story on deadline. The health science journalists who covered it well were processing complex statistical information quickly and presenting it clearly. The absence of the funding question is not an individual failing. It is a structural feature of how pharmaceutical research becomes clinical practice, and how clinical practice becomes news. The funding question is there in the academic literature. It is there in the conflict of interest disclosures that journals, by 2002, were beginning to require more systematically. It is not there in the front page story, which is where most people get their information about their medical care. Within 18 months, prescriptions for combined HRT in the United States had fallen by 66%. The number is striking, 66%. Two-thirds of the prescriptions that had been written every month for years simply stopped. Women who had been taking this drug, some of them for a decade or 2 decades, stopped. They stopped because their doctors advised them to stop, or because they decided themselves to stop, or because the amber bottle ran out and they did not refill it, or because the news had changed the calculation in a way they could not fully articulate but felt very clearly. Some of them experienced consequences. For women who had been on HRT for a long time, stopping was not always simple. The estrogen withdrawal that many experienced was real, the hot flushes returning, sometimes with greater intensity than they had had before starting. Sleep disrupting again, the body readjusting to a state it had been insulated from for years. There was not, in July 2002, a well-developed infrastructure for supporting women through this transition. There was the news, and there was the phone ringing at the surgery, and there was the doctor who was also processing the news and doing the best he could. The particular experience of the women who had been on HRT for many years before the WHI results, who had been told the drug was safe, who had taken it in good faith on the basis of medical advice given in good faith, on the basis of evidence that had been shaped by 30 years of pharmaceutical funding, that experience did not have a name. It was not a scandal in the way that thalidomide had been a scandal. Nobody was calling for prosecutions. The prescriptions had been written according to the best evidence available. The best evidence available had been assembled in an environment that is now, with the benefit of later research, more clearly understood to have been subject to systematic bias in one direction. The harm was real. The accountability was, as it usually is in these situations, diffuse. The amber bottle on the kitchen shelf in 2002 is not the amber bottle in 1962. The prescription that put it there was written by a different doctor for a different drug in a different era. But the shape of the thing is recognizable. The confidence, the authority, the sense of settled science, the gap between what was known and what was said, the question about funding that nobody was asking in the prominent place. The bottle sits there in the kitchen light, ordinary and final, while somewhere in Maryland a press conference is just ending. 8 years after July 2002, some documents became public that most people never read. They became public as part of litigation. The litigation that follows large pharmaceutical scandals with the reliable inevitability of a tide, lawyers and plaintiffs and discovery proceedings and boxes of internal documents moving through conference rooms and courtrooms over years, largely invisible to the general public until the moment when something is found that is too specific to be easily absorbed into the general category of corporate behavior. What was found, in 2010, in the documents that Wyeth was required to produce as part of that litigation was a relationship. The relationship was between Wyeth's pharmaceutical division and a company called DesignWrite, a medical communications firm based in Princeton, New Jersey. The documents show that Wyeth had paid DesignWrite to write papers about HRT, not to assist researchers in writing papers about HRT, to write the papers from scratch, with the scientific conclusions already determined, and then to find academic researchers whose names could be placed on the papers as authors before the papers were submitted to peer-reviewed journals. This practice is called ghostwriting. It is not new. Medical ghostwriting had been documented in other pharmaceutical contexts before 2010, but the Wyeth documents were unusually detailed, and what they revealed about the scale and systematicity of the practice was striking. Over the period covered by the documents, DesignWrite wrote or co-wrote dozens of papers on HRT. The papers were published in peer-reviewed journals with editorial review processes designed to ensure scientific rigor, with disclosure requirements intended to surface conflicts of interest. The journals were not aware that the papers had been written by a pharmaceutical communications firm. The researchers who lent their names were in some cases paid. In some cases they made substantive contributions. In others, they made minimal contributions but received the publication credit that advances academic careers and reinforces the impression of independent scientific consensus. The content of the papers was not fabricated. The statistics in them were real. The clinical claims were, within the limitations of the available evidence, defensible. What was shaped was not the facts, but the framing. The emphasis placed on certain findings, the interpretive context provided for others, the clinical recommendations drawn from the available evidence. The papers presented HRT in a consistently favourable light. The papers were published. The papers were cited. The papers became part of the literature that doctors read, and the guidelines that clinical bodies issued, and the context that shaped every HRT consultation for years. The 2010 documents also revealed that Wyeth maintained what its internal communications called a publication plan, a strategic program for managing the scientific literature on its products. The publication plan identified areas where additional published papers were needed to support the clinical case for HRT. It identified journals that were appropriate targets. It managed the pipeline of papers from commissioning through publication. It was, in its ambitions and its execution, a sophisticated operation that operated largely inside the formal systems of scientific publication, peer review, journal submission, authorship attribution, while being substantially directed by the commercial interests of the pharmaceutical company. It is important to say clearly what this was and what it was not. It was not a campaign of outright scientific fraud. The numbers were not invented. The trials were conducted to the extent that trials were cited more or less as described. What was managed was context, framing, emphasis, the interpretive layer that sits between raw data and clinical recommendation. Managing that layer is extraordinarily powerful. It is, in a sense, more powerful than fabricating data, because managing the frame means that even careful readers of the research will absorb the conclusions that the frame is designed to produce. The 2010 revelations were covered in the medical press. The BMJ published several pieces. JAMA published analysis. There were editorial responses and calls for greater transparency in pharmaceutical funding disclosure. The FDA did not take regulatory action specifically in response to the ghostwriting findings. No criminal charges were filed. Wyeth, which had by 2009 been acquired by Pfizer, settled a substantial number of lawsuits related to HRT-linked breast cancer cases. The settlements were large in aggregate but not individually identified in detail. The amount of money that changed hands as a result of the harm caused by the systematic management of the HRT literature was significant. The public reckoning with how that management had worked was not. There is a journal in a library somewhere, a medical library, shelved next to years of similar volumes, unremarkable in its blue spine and the typeface of its title on the cover, that contains one of the DesignWrite papers. It was published in the mid-1990s. It makes a case for the cardiovascular benefits of long-term HRT. It cites the Nurses' Health Study and other observational data. It is written in careful, measured academic prose. At the bottom of the first page, in the small print where disclosures live, there is an acknowledgement of institutional affiliations. There is no mention of DesignWrite. There is no mention of Wyeth. The paper is simply there in the journal, contributing to the weight of evidence, one of the many papers that shaped what the woman in the consulting room was told. You do not need to be outraged by this. Outrage is a waking hours response. Here, in the dark, what is available is something quieter, a kind of slow recognition, the feeling of understanding something that you half knew was there, but had not quite been given the language for. The language is, the evidence was shaped, the shaping was systematic. The system that allowed the shaping to happen was the same system that produced the evidence, the same system that turned the evidence into clinical guidance, the same system that put the tablet in the amber bottle and the amber bottle on the shelf. The woman in Ohio who was diagnosed with endometrial cancer in 1979 did not know about design right. There was no design right yet. The woman in California with breast cancer in 1983 did not know about publication plans. The woman in London whose GP told her that HRT protected her heart did not know about healthy user bias. The woman who asked her doctor in 1997 how long she should continue and was told, as long as it is helping, you did not know that the evidence for continuing was derived from a literature that had been substantially managed by the company that made the drug. They did not know because they had no way of knowing. The information was not available to them. It was available to some researchers and to some journalists, and to some people inside the pharmaceutical companies who knew what the publication plan contained. It was not available in the room where the prescription was written, or in the kitchen where the tablet was taken every morning with the coffee. The gap between what was known and what was available in the room is not just a medical story. It is a story about who gets access to complete information and who gets access to the curated version, and what the consequences are for the people who receive the curation without knowing it. The documents are in a library now. The litigation has largely resolved. The papers that Design Right wrote are still in the journals, still citable, their publication unretracted, their presence in the record unchanged. The women who took the tablets are older now, or are not. The pharmaceutical company that made the drug is part of a larger corporation that did not exist when the drug was first prescribed. The detail men have retired, or moved into other industries, or are still doing the same work for different drugs. The system continues. It has changed in some ways. Disclosure requirements are more rigorous. Some journals have strengthened their policies on ghostwriting and conflicts of interest. In other ways, it has not changed in the ways that would change the fundamental dynamics described here. The room is quiet. These thoughts settle without urgency. History is very full of these structures. The funded confidence, the managed literature, the consultation that could not quite contain all of the relevant information, and what you can do with the knowledge of them. From here, from this comfortable distance, is simply hold it. Not with anger, not with despair, but with the particular clarity that comes from understanding something all the way to its end. The library shelf holds the journals hold the papers hold the conclusions. Somewhere in the fine print the funding is disclosed, or it is not. Either way, the morning continues. When a consensus collapses, it does not collapse into nuance. This is one of the things that makes the collapse of a medical consensus particularly difficult to navigate from the inside. The women who had been told for 30 years that HRT was safe and beneficial were not, after July 2002, told. The picture is more complicated than we previously indicated. The long-term risks are real but modest. The benefits are real. You should weigh them against your specific circumstances and history. They were told in the broad cultural shorthand of newspaper headlines and anxious phone calls, and quickly redrawn clinical guidance, that HRT was dangerous, that it caused cancer, that it should be stopped. This is not quite what the Women's Health Initiative said. The WHI said that combined HRT, taken for several years, was associated with a modest increase in breast cancer risk, no reduction in cardiovascular events, and slight increases in risk of stroke and blood clots. It did not say HRT was dangerous for all women in all circumstances. The symptom relief function, the thing that had originally justified the drug's existence, was not impugned. The long-term preventive use, the extension of HRT from a treatment for menopausal discomfort into a decades-long cardiovascular prophylactic, that was the case the evidence had dismantled. The original, more limited case remained more or less intact. But the pendulum had been pulled very far in one direction for very long, and when it swung hard. By 2004, HRT prescriptions in the United States had fallen by 50% from their pre-WHI peak, and were still falling. Doctors who had been enthusiastic prescribers became cautious non-prescribers. Women who arrived at their doctor's offices with genuine menopausal symptoms, severe hot flushes, significant sleep disruption, the emotional and physical consequences of an abrupt surgical menopause, found that the conversation had changed completely. The drug that had been pressed upon them by well-meaning enthusiasts was now withheld by well-meaning skeptics. The pendulum had simply swung to the opposite end of the same arc. There is a particular group of women for whom the post-2002 skepticism caused real harm. Women with premature menopause, whether natural or surgical, who were in their 30s or 40s when their estrogen production stopped. For these women, the cardiovascular and bone protection that estrogen provides is not a theoretical benefit managed through the healthy user effect. It is a documented physiological reality. Early estrogen deprivation is associated with significantly elevated risks of cardiovascular disease and osteoporosis that estrogen replacement demonstrably addresses. The WHI findings, which were conducted in women with average age 63, were not applicable to a 40-year-old woman with surgical menopause. But the cultural response to the WHI did not always make this distinction. Women with premature menopause who sought HRT after 2002 found that the climate had changed. Some doctors were reluctant to prescribe. Some women felt they had to argue for treatment that their physiology clearly needed. Some left consultations without the prescription that would have addressed a real and specific hormonal deficit because the conversation was now occurring in the shadow of a finding that had been designed to answer a different question about a different population in a different hormonal context. The overcorrection had another consequence. It left millions of women with ordinary menopausal symptoms, manageable symptoms but real ones, without adequate treatment. The hot flushes and the sleep disruption and the joint aches and the mood changes that estrogen addressed were not, in most cases, dangerous. But they were significant. They affected quality of life in ways that were not trivial, and that were, for many women, not adequately managed by the alternatives that the post-WHI climate was willing to offer. The alternatives were things like soy isoflavones, whose evidence base was modest, and antidepressants, which worked for some women and not others, and cognitive behavioral therapy, which was valuable and was also not estrogen. The women who needed estrogen and could not get it were not visible in the same way that the women who had taken too much of it for too long were now visible. Invisibility is its own kind of problem. By 2012, a set of reanalyses of the WHI data had produced a more complicated picture. The original WHI study had enrolled women with a median age of 63. When researchers looked specifically at women who had started HRT close to menopause within 10 years, rather than years or decades later, the risk profile was different. The cardiovascular risk was not elevated and might in fact have been modestly protective. The breast cancer risk was still present but was modified by age at initiation and duration of use. A timing hypothesis emerged. The HRT begun close to menopause had a different risk-benefit profile from HRT begun many years after menopause. This distinction, what became known as the window of opportunity or the timing hypothesis, was important. It was not a vindication of the pre-2002 consensus, which had been recommending HRT to women of all ages as a long-term preventive measure without adequate evidence. It was a reframing, suggesting that estrogen used in the appropriate window for appropriate indications in appropriate populations might be a genuinely beneficial intervention with a manageable risk profile. The reframing was careful and evidence-based and important. It also arrived into a world that had been frightened by the original WHI findings and had reorganized its clinical practice around that fright, and it asked that world to hold a complicated distinction in mind while revising its guidance in a direction that could easily be misunderstood as simply going back to what had existed before. Going back to what had existed before was precisely what nobody wanted. What had existed before was a 30-year period of overuse driven by pharmaceutical funding. The reframing was not recommending a return to that. It was recommending a more precise, more evidence-based, more individuated approach to a drug that had real benefits for some women and real risks for others, and that deserved to be prescribed or withheld on that basis rather than on the basis of either the pre-2002 enthusiasm or the post-2002 alarm. The pendulum, in other words, needed to stop somewhere in the middle. Pendulums always do. The difficulty is that stopping in the middle requires holding in mind simultaneously the things that the pendulum was right about in each extreme position, and medical culture, like most culture, is better at holding one clear position than at sustaining a complicated both-and. The both-and position was, HRT has real benefits for specific women in specific circumstances and real risks that were systematically underdisclosed for commercial reasons for 30 years, and a proper response to this situation requires addressing both the benefits and the risks and the funding question. Honestly, simultaneously, without collapsing into either unqualified enthusiasm or reflexive avoidance. Whether medicine has arrived at this position is, as of 2026, an open question. The guidance from major medical bodies has evolved considerably since 2002. The evidence base has been extended and refined. The discourse around menopause has broadened and in some respects become more open. There are now clinicians whose entire practice is focused on menopause medicine and who bring to it a nuance and a depth that the 1990s consulting room did not always contain. There are patient advocacy groups and online communities and a cultural conversation about menopause that would have been unrecognizable a generation ago. There are also new drugs, new pharmaceutical companies, new clinical trials, new funding structures, new research agendas. Which brings us, in good time, to the next chapter. The pendulum has a long arc. It has been swinging for a long time. It is, at this moment, in a position that is more considered than any previous position, and also in a position that contains within it the seeds of whatever the next revision will be. The women of 2026 are taking their tablets in the same amber bottles, or their patches, or their gels, under advice that is better than the advice of 1992 in the ways that matter. Whether it is fully free of the structural problems that shaped the advice of 1992 is a different question, and one that will probably not be answered until the benefit of hindsight arrives, as it always does, a little later than you would prefer. The pendulum swings. The room is still. The night holds all of this without difficulty. The overcorrections, the reframings, the women who needed treatment and did not get it, the women who got treatment they did not need, the impossibly complicated middle ground where the honest answer lives. Let it all settle, very slowly, like sediment in water when the water has stopped being disturbed. The answer is not urgency. The answer is here, in the still. The year is 1996, and in an office in Minneapolis, a research team is reviewing the early results of a drug combination that's causing considerable excitement. The combination is fenfluramine and phentermine, fen-phen, as it has come to be called, and it is producing weight loss results that the diet drug market has not seen in years. The appetite suppression is real. The weight loss in clinical trials is significant. The demand from patients is, given 30 years of diet culture and the particular American relationship between weight and worth, essentially unlimited. Fen-phen is not HRT. The drug class is different. The mechanism is different. The patient population is partially overlapping and partially distinct. But the structural story is recognizable. There is a drug. The drug has a real effect on a real problem that a large and commercially interesting population has. The drug is prescribed widely, enthusiastically, in some cases to patients for whom the risk-benefit calculation was never quite as straightforward as the prescribing pattern suggested. The long-term safety data is incomplete because gathering long-term safety data takes time, and commercial imperatives are not always well served by waiting. The fen-phen story ended in 1997, when the FDA withdrew fenfluramine and dexfenfluramine from the market after reports emerged of cardiac valve abnormalities in women who had taken the combination. The abnormalities were serious. The drug combination that had been prescribed to an estimated 6 million Americans over the preceding 3 years was, it turned out, damaging heart valves in a proportion of users that the pre-market clinical trials had not detected. The lawsuits that followed were among the largest in pharmaceutical history. Wyeth, which had acquired American Home Products and therefore the maker of fenfluramine, paid out billions. The same Wyeth, in the same years, was managing the publication of papers supporting its HRT products through Design Right. The timeline of these two events, the fen-phen withdrawal in 1997 and the simultaneous management of the HRT literature, is not coincidental in the sense of being causally linked. They are coincidental in the sense that they reveal the same company managing, in the same decade, two separate situations in which commercial interest and patient safety were in tension, and in which the management of the situation was substantially shaped by that interest. After fen-phen, the diet drug market regrouped. Meridia, sibutramine, arrived in 1997, approved for long-term weight management. It was prescribed widely through the late 1990s and 2000s. In 2010, it was withdrawn from the US market after a clinical trial showed that it increased the risk of heart attack and stroke without reducing overall cardiovascular mortality. The clinical trial that found this, the SCOUT trial, was required by the FDA, which had granted Meridia's initial approval while acknowledging cardiovascular concerns. The drug was on the market for 13 years. Orlistat, Ali and Xenical came next in the commercial hierarchy of weight loss drugs, less cardiovascularly dramatic, with its own limitations and its own modestly managed evidence base. Through the 2000s and 2010s, it was the long-term weight loss pharmacotherapy option. Its effectiveness in real-world conditions was more modest than clinical trial results suggested. This gap between clinical trial results and real-world effectiveness is a feature of pharmaceutical research rather than a specific defect of Orlistat. Clinical trials enroll motivated, monitored patients who are not representative of the general population. The gap is known. It is not always prominently disclosed when the drug is approved or marketed. And then there is Ozempic, semaglutide, the drug that is currently, as of this particular night in 2026, as you lie wherever you are lying, in whatever comfortable darkness you have arranged around yourself, the most discussed pharmacological intervention in the world. Originally developed and approved for type 2 diabetes, semaglutide belongs to a class of drugs called GLP-1 receptor agonists, which work by mimicking a hormone that is produced in the gut after eating. They reduce appetite, slow gastric emptying, and produce in many people who take them a significant reduction in food intake and body weight. The weight loss results from semaglutide clinical trials are, by the standards of diet pharmacotherapy, extraordinary. Participants in trials have lost 15, 20, sometimes more % of their body weight. These are numbers that are very far outside the range of any previous weight loss drug. The effect is real. The mechanism is well characterized. The drug is genuinely doing something significant to appetite and to the metabolic processes associated with weight. The pharmaceutical companies that make semaglutide, Novo Nordisk primarily, with its Ozempic and Wegovy brands, are making extraordinary amounts of money. Novo Nordisk's market capitalization by 2024 had exceeded the GDP of Denmark, the country in which it was founded. The demand for semaglutide substantially exceeded supply. The drug had moved from a diabetes treatment to a weight loss drug to a cultural phenomenon, discussed in celebrity interviews and social media posts and mainstream newspaper features in the space of approximately 3 years. What is the long-term safety profile of semaglutide in people who are not diabetic and are using it for weight loss? This question is, as of 2026, not fully answered. The drug has been used for weight loss in large numbers of people for only a few years. The clinical trials that preceded approval were shorter than the period over which many people will now take the drug. There are questions, raised in published research, discussed at medical conferences, present in the academic conversation, about potential effects on thyroid tissue, about muscle mass loss, about the experience of stopping the drug and what weight regain looks like, about psychiatric side effects. These questions are not settled. The uncertainty is real. The pharmaceutical companies are funding research. The research is producing results. Some of the results are being published. The detail men, or their contemporary equivalents, the medical science liaisons and the sponsored continuing education events, and the influential physician speakers at professional conferences are carrying the results to doctors. The prescriptions are being written. The amber bottles, or their modern equivalents, are on shelves in millions of kitchens. The women who are taking the drug feel better, or feel worse, or feel something complicated that they are trying to describe to their doctors. The system is working as designed. This is not a claim that semaglutide is dangerous. It is not a claim that it is the next fen-phen or the next Premarin. It might be a genuinely revolutionary and broadly safe medical advance. The early results are real, and the mechanism is well understood, and the possibility that this drug will, over time, prove to be what its clinical trial results suggest is genuinely present. The pattern noted here is not a prediction about this drug. It is a description of the structural conditions in which this drug exists, the same structural conditions in which every drug exists, and what those conditions mean for the information that is available to the women taking it. The woman taking semaglutide in 2026 is, in some ways, in a better position than the woman taking Premarin in 1975. The FDA disclosure requirements are more rigorous. The clinical trial registry system means that more trials are pre-registered and their results, positive or null, are more likely to be in the public record. The ghostwriting guidelines at major journals are stronger. The post-market surveillance systems are more comprehensive. The discourse around pharmaceutical funding and its influence on research is more developed and more publicly accessible. In other ways, the structures are the same. The company has the resources to fund the research. The company shapes, within the bounds of what is permitted, what is researched and how. The prescribing physician receives information about the drug from sources that are not neutral. The patient receives information from the prescribing physician and from a cultural environment that has been saturated to varying degrees by the drug's marketing. The amber bottle is on the shelf. The morning is ordinary. The tablet is very small. The history of this particular tablet in full is not yet available. There is a particular kind of knowledge that is not in the brochure. It is not secret knowledge. It is available in the sense that the documents exist, the studies are in databases, the conflict of interest disclosures are in the fine print of the journals, but available is not the same as accessible, and accessible is not the same as present in the room where the decision is being made. What follows is an attempt to make some of that knowledge present, not as alarm, not as instruction, but as the kind of thing you might want to carry quietly into the consulting room with you. The first thing worth knowing is that pharmaceutical funding influences research in measurable, documented ways. This is not a theory. It is an established finding in the scientific literature on the sociology of medical research. Studies funded by pharmaceutical companies are more likely to produce favorable results than equivalent studies funded by independent sources. This finding has been replicated across drug classes and decades. The mechanism is not primarily fraud. It is the accumulation of smaller decisions, which endpoints to measure, which populations to enroll, how to analyze the data, how to frame the conclusions, that, taken together, produce a body of research that reflects the interests of those who funded it. Knowing this does not mean dismissing industry-funded research. It means holding it with the appropriate degree of calibration. The second thing worth knowing is what to ask about a study. When a doctor cites research to support a recommendation, a few questions can significantly change the texture of the conversation. Who funded the study? Was it a randomized controlled trial or an observational study, and if observational, what are the implications of that for interpreting the results? Was this a short-term trial whose results are being applied to long-term use? Was the population in the trial similar to you in terms of age, hormonal status, medical history? These are not hostile questions. They are the questions that methodologically literate people ask, and a good doctor will welcome them, and a doctor who does not welcome them is itself information. The third thing worth knowing is that the current HRT guidance is more nuanced than either the pre-2002 consensus or the post-2002 alarm would suggest. The current position of most major menopause medical bodies, including the British Menopause Society, the North American Menopause Society, and the International Menopause Society, is that HRT is appropriate for many women with menopausal symptoms, that the risks are real but modest for most women when initiated close to menopause and used for a limited period, that the decision should be individualized, and that women with premature menopause have a clear indication for treatment that should not be withheld because of the WHI findings. This position is a substantial improvement on what preceded it. It is based on better evidence. It is, compared to the confident pronouncements of the 1990s, appropriately humble. The fourth thing worth knowing is that the current HRT conversation is still occurring in an environment shaped by commercial interests. The renewed interest in HRT that has developed in the 2010s and 2020s, the celebrity advocates, the documentary films, the online communities, the particular urgency of the current menopause conversation has commercial actors embedded in it. Pharmaceutical companies have interests in the menopause market. Clinicians who are prominent advocates for HRT have, in some cases, relationships with those companies. This does not mean that the advocacy is wrong. It means that the same structural considerations that applied to the 1990s apply in modified form now. The funding question is worth asking of the current evidence, not just the historical evidence. The fifth thing worth knowing, and perhaps the most important one, is that you are allowed to be uncertain. The medical system is not always comfortable with patient uncertainty. It tends to resolve uncertainty, to provide a recommendation, to prescribe or not to prescribe, to send you away with a plan. This resolution is often useful. Sometimes it is premature. The woman who is uncertain about whether to take HRT, who has real symptoms and real concerns about risks, and a history that makes the calculation specific to her, is not failing to understand the evidence. She is responding appropriately to a situation in which the evidence is genuinely more complicated than the consulting room often has time to contain. Uncertainty is not the same as paralysis. It is possible to act under uncertainty, to make the best decision available with the information at hand, while remaining open to revision as the information changes. This is what doctors do at their best. It is what patients can do too when they have enough information to understand the shape of the uncertainty rather than simply the resolution that the system is offering them. There is also this. The experience of menopause varies enormously. For some women it is a passage so undramatic as to be almost unnoticed, a few months of mild disruption, and then a new equilibrium. For others it is a multi-year period of significant physical and emotional disturbance that affects work, relationships, sleep, identity, the whole texture of daily life. The gap between these experiences is real and documented, and has been, historically, substantially obscured by the tendency to treat menopause as a single phenomenon, rather than a range of experiences that may or may not require medical intervention, and may or may not be well served by any specific medical intervention at any given point. The women who most need good information about HRT are not the ones in the easy middle. Mild symptoms, clear history, no particular risk factors, a decision that is genuinely not very complicated. The women who most need good information are the ones for whom the calculation is actually difficult, the ones with personal or family histories of breast cancer, the ones with premature menopause, the ones with severe symptoms that are significantly affecting their functioning, the ones who have been told different things by different doctors and cannot quite make sense of the landscape. For those women, the structural problems described in this story, the funded literature, the managed framing, the consultation that could not quite contain all of the relevant information, are not historical curiosities. They are present conditions. The amber bottle on the shelf in 2026 is not the amber bottle in 1962. The evidence behind the current prescription is better, the disclosure requirements are stronger, the clinical guidance has been revised in the light of the WHI and the reanalysis that followed. The conversation in the consulting room is better informed than it was. These improvements are real and should be acknowledged. They are also incomplete, and the incompleteness is structural rather than incidental. And knowing that it is structural means knowing that the remedy for it is not simply waiting for more research, though more research is always needed, but developing the habits of inquiry that allow you to engage with the research, the recommendations, and the system that produces them from an informed rather than a simply trusting position. Trusting your doctor is not wrong. The trust should coexist with a few questions. The questions are available. The information to evaluate the answers is more available than it has ever been. The woman in the waiting room in 1962 did not have access to clinicaltrials.gov, to the published literature on pharmaceutical ghostwriting, to the reanalyses of the WHI, to the tools that would allow her to look up the funding behind the study her doctor was citing. You have access to all of these things. The access changes the conversation if you bring it with you. This is not a call to distrust medicine. Medicine has done extraordinary things and will continue to do extraordinary things, and the distrust of medicine as a reflex, the rejection of pharmaceutical intervention as inherently corrupt, the preference for the natural over the evidence-based, produces its own harms, its own women suffering unnecessarily from conditions that have effective treatments, its own information vacuums filled by people with motivations that are not better simply because they are not pharmaceutical. The answer is not to distrust the system. The answer is to understand it, with the particular calibrated skepticism of someone who has read its history and knows what structures produce what kinds of error. You know the history now. You have been in the waiting rooms and the kitchens and the corporate offices and the laboratory corridors and the press conference in Maryland. You have seen the brochures and the publication plans and the detail men and the amber bottles. You know the shape of it. You can carry it with you, gently, into the next consulting room, where the doctor will fold his hands and the prescription pad will be warm and the amber bottle will be waiting to occupy its place on the shelf. The conversation you have there will be better for what you know. There is something that has been sitting at the edge of this story since the beginning, something that has been named but not dwelt upon, something that deserves a chapter of its own in this quiet, unhurried hour. Premarin, the drug at the centre of this story, the most prescribed drug in America for much of the 1980s and 1990s, the drug prescribed to millions of women as a source of natural estrogen, is made from the urine of pregnant mares. This fact is stated in the name, if you know the abbreviation, pregnant mare urine. It sits in the medical record in plain sight, and it is, when you stop to think about it, a fairly extraordinary thing. There are farms. In the American Midwest and in Canada, there are, or were, very large farms where mares were kept in a state of near-continuous pregnancy in order to sustain the production of estrogen-rich urine. The mares were fitted with collection devices. They were given limited access to water, which concentrates the urine. They spent much of their pregnant lives in small stalls. The foals, which are a byproduct of the process, were typically sold, often to the meat market. This is a livestock operation. It is a pharmaceutical production facility. It is a place where the hormonal experience of the female body, in another species, is extracted and processed and put into a small tablet and placed in an amber bottle and given to a woman by her doctor. The animal welfare concerns around Premarin production were documented from the 1980s onwards and became a subject of activist attention through the 1990s. When the WHI findings caused the collapse in prescriptions in 2002, there was a corresponding decline in demand for Premarin and consequently a significant reduction in the number of mares used in the production process. Some farms closed. This was to the extent that the mares' situation had been a cause of concern, an unintended benefit of the collapse in HRT prescriptions. A reduction in pharmaceutical use had reduced animal suffering in a production process that most of the women participating in that pharmaceutical market did not know existed. Why are we spending time with the mares? Not to distress you. Distress is not the purpose of this hour, which has always been and remains an hour for settling into something quieter and more still than the waking day. We are spending time with the mares because they are a kind of emblem. They represent something about the relationship between female biology and pharmaceutical commerce that the rest of this story has been circling, the way in which the hormonal experience of the female body has been understood in the pharmaceutical era primarily as a resource, something to be extracted, processed, formulated, prescribed, something that the market has an interest in and that the market manages. This is not unique to HRT, and the mares are not a metaphor for women. That would be too neat, too reductive, the kind of gesture that collapses genuine complexity into a pointed observation. But there is something in the adjacency of the two situations, the mares in their stalls providing the raw material, the women in their consulting rooms receiving the product, that rewards a moment of quiet attention. Both groups of bodies are in a relationship with this particular pharmaceutical industry that they did not choose, that they did not fully know the terms of, that served purposes larger than and somewhat indifferent to their individual well-being. Synthetic estrogens exist. There were and are alternatives to equine-derived estrogen. Some HRT formulations use estradiol, the form of estrogen produced by the human ovary, which can be synthesized without any animal products. The persistence of Premarin as the dominant product in the HRT market for decades was not purely pharmacological, it was also commercial. Premarin had the FDA approval, the manufacturing infrastructure, the prescriber relationships, the brand recognition that had been built over decades. The pharmaceutical company had no particular incentive to develop competing products. The prescribers had no particular incentive to switch. The market continued around a product whose continued dominance owed as much to commercial inertia as to any specific therapeutic advantage. There is a version of the HRT story that focuses exclusively on the harm done to women, the breast cancer risk not disclosed, the cardiovascular benefit not supported, the 30 years of prescriptions extended by funded research and managed literature. This is a real and important version of the story, and it has been told here, carefully. There is another version that focuses on the benefit, the women for whom estrogen was genuinely transformative, who slept again, who moved through menopause with greater ease, whose bones and vaginal tissue and mood and sleep were significantly helped. This version is also true. And there is this version, that the pharmaceutical management of the female hormonal life course is a project that has been ongoing since at least the 1940s, and that the project is conducted by commercial entities with financial interests that do not always align with the interests of the women in the consulting rooms, and that the mares in the stalls in Manitoba are part of the infrastructure of that project, and that the amber bottle on the kitchen shelf is the visible end of a supply chain that begins in places most of the women opening the bottle have never thought about and may not want to. The mares are, as of 2026, fewer in number. The demand for equine-derived estrogen has declined as synthetic and bioidentical alternatives have become more available, and as the WHI findings drove many patients and prescribers toward formulations that did not carry the Wyeth Premarin history. The farms still exist. The production continues at a reduced scale. Somewhere tonight, on a farm in the American Midwest or in Canada, a mare is standing in a stall in the dark. She's pregnant. She's fitted with a collection device. She does not know that she's part of a pharmaceutical history that stretches from a German laboratory in 1934, when the active components of equine urine were first characterized, to a press conference in Maryland in 2002, and onward to the current conversation about menopause and medicine and what women deserve to know. She simply stands in the dark. The night is large around her. She breathes. This chapter does not require you to feel any particular way about this. It only requires you to know it, to have it as part of the complete picture of what the amber bottle contains all the way back to its beginning. The complete picture is available to you now. You can hold it gently, as you hold all of the rest of this story, with clarity rather than alarm, with knowledge rather than distress, with the particular piece that comes from understanding something fully rather than seeing only the part that has been curated for your consumption. The night holds the mares as it holds everything. The production continues. The tablets arrive in their bottles. The doctors write their prescriptions and believe in them and give them in good faith, as they always have, as they always do, as they will continue to do in the morning. The consultation room is warm. The prescription pad is ready. The fountain pen is in its holder. The second hand on the waiting room clock moves in its stuttering way toward the moment when your name will be called. There is nothing alarming in any of this. There is only the knowledge, which is yours now, and the night, which is deep and quiet and makes room for everything without difficulty. The mares breathe in the dark. You breathe in the dark. The amber bottle is on the shelf, and somewhere the morning's getting ready to begin. Think of the women. Not as a category, not as a market, not as the menopausal cohort or the HRT users, or the postmenopausal demographic that appears in the pharmaceutical industry's market research documents, with its estimated size and its commercial potential. Think of them as they actually were. Individual women in individual kitchens on individual mornings, going about the lives they were living, which were full of things that had nothing to do with estrogen, and a great deal to do with the specific texture of being alive in a particular body in a particular time. Think of the woman in Ohio in 1979, the one who was diagnosed with endometrial cancer after 4 years on Premarin. She had a daughter who was finishing high school that year. She had a kitchen with yellow curtains that she had made herself because she could never find exactly the right shade in the shops. She had a husband who drove her to the hospital appointments and held her hand in the waiting room with the particular wordless tenderness of a man who did not know what to say and knew that what he said was less important than being there. She recovered. She lived for another 30 years. She was prescribed the combined formulation after the endometrial cancer scare, and she took it, and she managed, and the cancer did not return, and she grew old and died of something else entirely. She is not a cautionary tale. She is a person who had cancer and recovered and lived her life. Think of the woman in California in 1983, the one who was diagnosed with breast cancer. She asked her oncologist about the HRT connection and was told the evidence was mixed. She spent years wondering whether the wondering was useful. It was not in any practical sense. The cancer was treated. She survived. She did not go back on HRT. She became, without particularly choosing to, the kind of woman who reads the labels carefully and asks the question about funding and is regarded in some consulting rooms as difficult. She was not difficult. She was paying attention. 30 years later, she would have been called an informed patient. In 1983, there was no particularly good word for her. Think of the woman in London whose GP told her that HRT protected her heart. She's in her late 80s now, if she's still alive. She took HRT through the 1990s and stopped, with everyone else, after 2002. Her heart is fine, as far as she knows. The most recent checkup said fine, everything is fine, come back in a year. Whether the HRT contributed to the fineness of her heart, or whether the fineness of her heart contributed to her being the kind of woman who sought out HRT is not something that can be determined. The healthy user effect is not visible from the inside. She simply got older, and her heart continued, which is all that most of us can ask of it. Think of the woman in the consulting room in 1997, the one who asked how long she should continue and was told as long as it's helping you. She continued for another 5 years. She stopped in 2002 and had a difficult 6 months of returning symptoms and then a new equilibrium, and then eventually the particular quiet of a body that has settled into a new hormonal normal. She's not angry, particularly. She's the age now that her mother was when she seems to remember her mother being old, and she's not old in the way her mother was old, which she attributes to various things: diet, exercise, luck, the particular biological lottery of her particular body. She does not know what contribution, if any, the years of HRT made to that. She cannot know. The counterfactual is unavailable. What these women share is not the same story but the same situation. They were inside a system that was managing their information while presenting itself as simply providing it. They were making decisions based on what was available in the room, and the room contained what the system had placed there, and the system had been shaped by interests that were not identical to theirs. This is not a description of exceptional circumstances. This is a description of what it is to be a patient in a modern healthcare system, with the caveat that the degree to which the system's information management is more or less transparent, more or less complete, more or less honest about its own limitations, varies and can be influenced. And the woman who walks into the consulting room with questions about funding is applying a small, genuine, available corrective to a structural problem. There is a particular quality to the knowledge that this story produces if it is received the way it has been offered, slowly, in the dark, without alarm. It is not the sharp knowledge of a scandal, the kind that produces outrage and then fades. It is more like topographic knowledge, a sense of the shape of the terrain rather than a detailed map of any single route through it. You know the terrain now. You know that funded research tilts in the direction of the funder. You know that the consultation room contains what the system places there. You know that the gap between the most alarming conclusion and the most reassuring one is often where the honest answer lives. You know that the amber bottle on the shelf has a history that extends back further than the prescription date on its label. This knowledge does not have to produce anxiety. It can produce something more useful than anxiety, a calibrated, alert, low-level skepticism that does not resist medical advice but engages with it, asks the second question, requests the reference, looks up the funding disclosure, remains open to revision. This is what being a genuinely informed patient looks like, as opposed to the image of the informed patient as someone who has simply consumed more medical content. Information is not the same as understanding. Understanding the structure is more useful than accumulating the data. What endures from the HRT story is not primarily the specific findings, the breast cancer risk, the cardiovascular non-benefit, the uterine cancer signal from 1975, though these are important. What endures is the demonstration of how a medical consensus can be built, sustained, and dismantled, and what role commercial funding plays in that process. This demonstration is durable because the process it describes is durable. The specific drugs change. The disease categories change. The cultural anxieties that the drugs are designed to address change. The pharmaceutical industry, the medical profession, the regulatory system, the research infrastructure, and the relationship between them. These change more slowly and within more limited parameters. The women who took HRT in the 1970s and 1980s and 1990s were not naive. They were not passive. They were making reasonable decisions with the information available to them in a world that was consistently telling them that the available information was sufficient, that the decision was clear, that medicine had the answer, and the answer was this particular tablet in this particular bottle. The insufficiency of the information was not visible from where they stood. It is more visible now, with the benefit of what the subsequent decades have produced. The WHI, the litigation documents, the reanalyses, the scholarship on pharmaceutical funding and medical ghostwriting and the sociology of clinical knowledge production. The women of 2026 are in a better position. Not a perfect position, not a fully transparent position, but a better one. The tools for interrogating the evidence are more accessible. The discourse around pharmaceutical funding is more developed. The requirement for clinical trial registration means that more of the research record is visible. The conversations about menopause and HRT that are happening now, in clinics, in online forums, in documentary films, in the particular cultural moment around menopause that has developed in the past decade, are more nuanced than anything available to the women of 1992. The women of 2026 are also in a position to do something that the women of 1975 could not. They can look back across the whole arc of this story and see its shape. They can see where the funded confidence was and where the overcorrection went, and where the honest middle ground has been gradually constructed out of better evidence and harder questions, and the accumulated experience of millions of women whose individual experiences taken together constitute a body of knowledge that no single clinical trial could produce. That knowledge is theirs. You are part of the accumulation of it. What you know tonight, in this comfortable dark, is a small addition to what is collectively known. Let it settle. Let the women settle into their kitchens and their consulting rooms and their bridge clubs and their particular places in history, doing the best they could with what they had. Let the amber bottles stand on their shelves. Let the detail men close their briefcases. Let the pharmaceutical executives go home to their families. Let the scientists in their labs continue the slow, necessary work of finding out what is actually true, which takes longer than the market would like, and longer than the news cycle accommodates, and longer than any of us, waiting in the orange vinyl chairs, would prefer. Let the research proceed. Let the questions be asked. Let the morning come. Thank you so much for watching. If you'd like to see more videos like this, please consider leaving a like and subscribing to the channel. It really helps us keep making more content. See you in the next one. The waiting room is quiet now. The orange vinyl chairs are empty. The magazines are still on the low table, the same magazines they have always been, slightly out of date, slightly worn at the corners. The clock moves in its stuttering increments. The second hand completes its circuit and then completes it again, as it always has, as it will continue to do through all the morning still to come. Behind the closed door of the consultation room there is silence. The consultation has ended. The doctor has folded his hands and uncapped his pen and written what he believed to be correct, based on what he knew, which was what had been given to him to know. The patient has taken the small slip of paper and folded it into her bag. She has stepped back into whatever the weather is today, warm or cold, bright or grey, and returned to the ordinary life that continues regardless of what happens in rooms like this one. The amber bottle is on the kitchen shelf. It has always been on the kitchen shelf. The salt is beside it, and the ceramic rooster from Portugal, and the coffee tin with the lid that doesn't quite seal. The light comes through the window over the sink in the way it does at this time of morning, at this particular angle, the particular quality of it familiar and unremarkable and, in its own way, very beautiful. You know the story now, all of it, the laboratory in Germany and the name that was registered in 1898, which is a different story but the same structure. The brochures and the detail men and the branded notepads in the doctor's offices, the nurse's health study and the healthy user effect. The press conference in Maryland on the 9th of July 2002. The design right documents in the litigation files. The mayors in the dark in Manitoba. The women in their kitchens and their consulting rooms and their bridge clubs, doing the best they could with what they were given. You carry all of it gently now, not as a weight, but as a map. The map shows the terrain. The terrain is the terrain it has always been. You know its features. You know where the gradients are and where the ground is uncertain, and where the well-evidenced paths run. You can walk it more safely for having looked at it clearly. The room where you are is very still. Whatever surface is holding you well. The temperature is right. The dark is comfortable. The sounds that the world is making, and the traffic very far away, the house settling, the breath of the night, those sounds are part of the quiet rather than in opposition to it. You're almost gone now. The story has resolved itself. The amber bottle on the kitchen shelf is standing in the morning light, simply itself, a small object in a world full of small objects, each one with its history and its manufacturer and its debt to the research that preceded it and the funding behind the research and the interests behind the funding. You know this, you know it, and it does not alarm you. Knowledge at this hour is not a call to action. It is a kind of peace. The clock in the waiting room makes its slow circuit. Somewhere, a morning is beginning. Somewhere, a prescription is being written. Somewhere, a woman is swallowing her tablet with her coffee, or deciding not to, or asking a second question, or sitting with the specific productive uncertainty of someone who knows enough to know what she does not know. She is doing the best she can, as they always have, as you are doing now. Let the waiting room be empty, let the kitchens be still, let the amber bottles stand in the dark on their shelves, in the particular quiet of a house where everyone is finally asleep. You have been here, in this story, for a long time. You have earned the rest that follows it. Sleep now. The morning will come, as it always does, ordinary and full of what it will bring, and you will meet it with what you know, which is more than you knew before, and which is enough. If you liked this video, let me know where in the world you're watching from and what time it is. I'm always curious about that. And if you have a suggested topic, feel free to leave it in the comments.